Before the Brotherhood of Steel ever existed as an order, a creed, or a symbol of post-war power, its roots lay buried in the final moral collapse of the pre-war United States, a nation whose military doctrine had drifted far from defense and into absolute technological dominance, where the soldier was no longer merely a protector of the state, but a delivery system for overwhelming force, shaped by an ideology that equated progress with control and victory with annihilation. And nowhere was this doctrine more clearly embodied than in the research, secrecy, and authority granted to military installations like the Mariposa military base, a facility that outwardly functioned as a standard West Tech research and development center, but inwardly served as a sealed crucible for the most ethically corrosive experiment ever sanctioned by the United States government, the forced evolutionary virus program, which was hidden not only from the public but from much of the military itself, including the very officers tasked with guarding it. And it was within this system that Captain Arthur Maxson, a career military officer trained in obedience, chain of command, and operational secrecy, found himself stationed in the final months before the Great War, overseeing security forces that believed they were protecting a conventional research site while unknowingly enabling crimes that fundamentally violated every oath they had sworn, because the pre-war United States military was structured to reward compliance and punish inquiry, fostering an environment where orders were absolute and moral accountability was diffused upward into an invisible hierarchy, a structure that had already been strained by the resource wars, global energy collapse, domestic unrest, and the creeping normalization of authoritarian measures such as civilian surveillance, forced relocations, and the suspension of constitutional protections, all justified in the name of national survival. And it was this same justification that allowed West Tech scientists, under government contract, to abduct human test subjects, including prisoners and civilians, and subject them to forced evolutionary virus exposure in the pursuit of creating biologically enhanced soldiers, a goal aligned perfectly with a military doctrine that saw the human body as another platform to be optimized, much like power armor or automated weapon systems. And yet this alignment fractured when evidence of these experiments reached Captain Maxson through direct discovery rather than sanctioned briefing, because canon sources established that Maxson learned of the forced evolutionary virus experimentation firsthand, not as an abstract concept but as a concrete violation involving living subjects reduced to biological material. And this discovery did not occur in isolation but against the backdrop of a world already unraveling, where international tensions with the People's Republic of China had escalated into open warfare, where Anchorage had been retaken at enormous human cost, and where the United States military increasingly viewed moral compromise as a temporary inconvenience on the path to inevitable victory, a mindset that Maxson, despite his rank, could no longer reconcile with his personal sense of duty. And it is critical to understand that Maxson's ethical fracture was not a sudden rebellion but a slow collision between institutional loyalty and individual conscience, because he initially followed protocol by demanding explanations, only to find that the chain of command either endorsed the experiments or deferred responsibility to classified authorities beyond his reach, revealing a system designed to insulate itself from moral scrutiny. And when Maxson realized that the experiments were not an aberration but a sanctioned continuation of pre-war policy, he faced a choice that no military doctrine could resolve, because obedience would make him complicit in crimes against humanity, while defiance would sever him from the very institution that defined his identity. And the gravity of this moment cannot be overstated, because Maxson's decision to reject his orders occurred before the Great War, meaning the Brotherhood of Steel was not born as a reaction to nuclear devastation, but as a direct response to pre-war corruption. making it one of the only post-war factions whose ideological foundation predates the bombs themselves. And when Maxson chose to act, he did so not as a revolutionary but as a commanding officer exercising what he believed to be his final moral authority, executing the scientists responsible for the forced evolutionary virus program at Mariposa, a decision that remains one of the most controversial acts in Brotherhood history because it established a precedent that technology without ethical restraint was more dangerous than ignorance, and that those who wielded such technology could forfeit their right to live if they crossed certain boundaries. And following this act, Maxson severed all ties with the United States government, transmitting a message of secession that declared his unit no longer under federal command. A message that received no response because the world ended shortly thereafter, on the 23rd of October 2077, when nuclear war erased the political structure Maxson had rejected, leaving his decision suspended in a vacuum where no authority remained to challenge or validate it. And in the immediate aftermath of the Great War, as nuclear fire reshaped the surface world into irradiated wasteland, Maxson led his surviving soldiers, along with their families, away from Mariposa and into the Lost Hills bunker complex, carrying with them not only weapons and technology, but a shared trauma that fused their identity as both survivors and witnesses to humanity's failure. And it was here that the philosophical seeds of the Brotherhood of Steel were planted, because Maxson understood that the world had not been destroyed by ignorance or weakness, but by technological advancement, divorced from ethical responsibility, a lesson reinforced by the sight of a dead civilization whose greatest achievements had become instruments of extinction, and thus the origins of the Brotherhood cannot be understood as a simple desire to preserve technology, but as an attempt to control it, to act as custodians rather than conquerors, shaped by the belief that unrestricted access to advanced weapons and research would inevitably lead to repetition of the Great War. And this belief emerged directly from Maxson's experience within the pre-war military, where compartmentalization and blind obedience allowed atrocities to flourish unseen, and therefore the Brotherhood's foundational worldview was defined by distrust not only of governments but of human nature itself, a conviction that knowledge without discipline leads to annihilation, and that survival in the post-war world required not democracy or expansion, but restraint, hierarchy, and continuity, values Maxson believed had been abandoned long before the bombs fell, making the Brotherhood of Steel less a product of the apocalypse and more a verdict on the world that caused it, a living indictment forged in the final days of pre-war America, when one officer chose to step outside the chain of command, and in doing so created a legacy that would shape the wasteland for centuries to come. The Mariposa Mutiny was not a sudden eruption of chaos, but a deliberate and irreversible break born from certainty, because by the time Captain Roger Maxson acted, there was no ambiguity left about what the Mariposa military base truly represented, as the forced evolutionary virus program had been fully exposed to him not through rumor or intercepted intelligence, but through direct confirmation within the facility itself, revealing that West Tech scientists, operating under authority granted by the pre-war United States government, had transformed a military research installation into a site of systematic human experimentation, where abducted subjects were stripped of identity and reduced to test variables in an attempt to engineer a new form of soldier, and this revelation carried a weight far greater than any battlefield order Maxson had ever received, because it demonstrated that the chain of command he had trusted was not merely flawed but morally bankrupt, having sanctioned experiments that violated the most basic principles of human dignity while hiding behind layers of classification and patriotic rhetoric. And the significance of this moment lies in the fact that Maxson did not interpret the forced evolutionary virus as a tragic necessity of war, but as proof that the war itself had already been lost in spirit, long before nuclear weapons were launched, because the transformation of civilians into experimental subjects represented a collapse of the very values the military claimed to defend. And it was this realization that triggered the Mariposa Mutiny, an event canonically defined not as a rebellion against authority for personal gain, but as an act of conscience carried out by a commanding officer who believed that lawful orders cease to exist when they demand participation in crimes against humanity. And Maxson's response was decisive and absolute, as he ordered the execution of the West Tech scientists responsible for the forced evolutionary virus experiments, an action that would later be mythologized within Brotherhood doctrine, but which, at the time, was an act of grim finality rather than triumph, because it closed the door on any possibility of reconciliation with the pre-war government and cemented Maxson's unit as outlaws in the eyes of a system that no longer mattered. And it is essential to understand that this execution was not carried out in ignorance of its consequences, because Maxson was fully aware that killing government scientists constituted treason under pre-war law, yet he concluded that obedience to a criminal state was itself a greater betrayal. And this reasoning would later form the moral backbone of the Brotherhood's worldview, where legality and legitimacy were no longer synonymous. And following the executions, Maxson formally declared his secession from the United States government, transmitting a broadcast message that stated his unit would no longer recognize federal authority, a declaration that stands as one of the last acts of political dissent recorded before the Great War erased the structures it defied. And although the message received no response due to the rapid collapse of global civilization, its symbolic importance cannot be overstated, because it marked the first time a United States military unit renounced the government not for ideological extremism or insurrectionary ambition, but for ethical survival. And when the nuclear exchange of October 23, 2077, annihilated the world above, Maxson's decision was retroactively transformed from mutiny into genesis, because the government that would have prosecuted him ceased to exist, leaving his unit isolated but intact, burdened with forbidden knowledge, and surrounded by the ruins of a civilization that had validated his fears in the most catastrophic way imaginable. And in the immediate aftermath, as radiation storms swept the surface and communications networks fell silent, Maxson gathered his soldiers and their families, individuals who had trusted him not only with their lives, but with the future of their children, and led them away from Mariposa and into the Lost Hills bunker complex, a location chosen not merely for its defensive capability, but for its symbolic separation from the corrupted institutions of the old world. And it was during this migration that the identity of the group began to shift from a military unit into a proto-society, because survival now depended not on orders from above, but on shared purpose, mutual discipline, and the preservation of knowledge deemed too dangerous to return to general circulation. And within the safety of Lost Hills, Maxson began the process of redefining what his people were and what they would become, drawing directly from the lessons of Mariposa by concluding that technology itself was not evil, but that humanity's inability to restrain its use had proven fatal, and thus the concept of a new order emerged, one that would safeguard advanced technology, not to dominate others, but to prevent its misuse. And this idea was formalized through the adoption of a new name, the Brotherhood of Steel, a title that reflected both unity and strength while deliberately distancing the group from national identity, signaling that their allegiance was no longer to a flag or government, but to a philosophy rooted in preservation and control. And the Brotherhood's founding principles were shaped directly by the Mariposa Mutiny, because the memory of the forced evolutionary virus experiments became a permanent warning embedded in their culture, A reminder that even well-intentioned research can become monstrous when conducted without accountability. And this is why the Brotherhood's earliest laws emphasized hierarchy, initiation, and restricted access to technology, as Maxson believed that only those who demonstrated discipline and understanding could be trusted with knowledge powerful enough to end the world. And it is important to recognize that this new order was not conceived as a ruling power or a humanitarian organization, but as a custodial one, tasked with surviving long enough to prevent humanity from repeating its greatest mistake. And while later generations would reinterpret, challenge, or even betray these ideals, the Brotherhood of Steel was born in a moment of absolute moral clarity, forged not by the bombs, but by the choice to reject a future built on human experimentation, making the Mariposa Mutiny not merely a footnote in pre-war history, but the defining event that transformed a group of soldiers into one of the most enduring and influential factions of the post-war world. Isolationism was not an accidental consequence of the Brotherhood of Steel's early survival, but a consciously adopted philosophy forged directly from the lessons of Mariposa and the collapse of the pre-war world. Because Roger Maxson understood that the destruction of civilization had not occurred solely due to nuclear weapons, but because advanced technology had been allowed to proliferate within a society incapable of restraining its own ambition. And as the Brotherhood settled into the Lost Hills bunker, cut off from the surface by radiation, chaos, and the sudden absence of any central authority, Maxson and his successors began to formalize a worldview that rejected expansion, diplomacy, and reconstruction in favor of controlled preservation, believing that humanity's first responsibility after the apocalypse was not to rebuild but to survive without repeating the sins that had caused its near extinction. And this belief system became the foundation of Brotherhood isolationism, a doctrine that emphasized withdrawal from the wasteland rather than engagement with it, rooted in the conviction that the outside world, populated by desperate survivors, raiders, and emerging settlements, lacked the discipline and historical memory necessary to wield advanced technology responsibly, and this conviction was reinforced by the Brotherhood's own experience as custodians of weapons, armor, and research artifacts that far surpassed anything available to most post-war groups, creating a stark imbalance of power that Maxson feared would corrupt both the Brotherhood and those it interacted with if left unchecked. And thus isolation became a form of moral quarantine, a way to insulate the order from the chaos outside while preventing their technological superiority from reshaping the world in unpredictable and potentially catastrophic ways. And to enforce this philosophy, the Brotherhood codified a rigid internal structure that mirrored military hierarchy while stripping it of national allegiance, establishing ranks such as Initiate, Knight, Paladin, and Elder, each associated with specific responsibilities and levels of access to technology, ensuring that knowledge and equipment were distributed not according to ambition or charisma, but through demonstrated loyalty, training, and adherence to doctrine. And this hierarchy was not merely symbolic but operational, governing every aspect of life within Lost Hills, from education and resource allocation to combat readiness and research oversight, because the Brotherhood believed that order was the only safeguard against degeneration, and this belief extended to their laws, which were written to emphasize obedience, secrecy, and collective survival over individual freedom, reflecting Maxson's conclusion that the freedoms of the old world had been exploited by corporations and governments to justify atrocities, and therefore could not be blindly reinstated in the new one. And central to these laws was the technological preservation doctrine, a principle that defined the Brotherhood's core mission as the recovery, cataloging, and safeguarding of advanced pre-war technology, not for immediate use or distribution, but for controlled storage and study, with the explicit goal of preventing dangerous innovations from falling into untrained hands. And this doctrine was informed by the forced evolutionary virus catastrophe, which served as a permanent cautionary tale demonstrating how even well-funded, well-intentioned research could spiral into moral disaster when divorced from accountability. And as a result, the Brotherhood developed strict protocols governing who could access research facilities, who could operate advanced machinery, and under what circumstances weapons could be deployed, creating a culture where restraint was valued as highly as strength. And this culture extended into recruitment practices, as the Brotherhood initially restricted membership to the descendants of the original Mariposa survivors, believing that shared history and indoctrination from birth were essential to maintaining ideological purity, because allowing outsiders into the order too early risked importing the very values and behaviors that had destroyed the old world. And this decision reinforced isolationism by turning the Brotherhood inward, transforming it into a closed society that measured time in generations rather than years. And within this insular environment, education became a central pillar of survival, with children raised not only to maintain equipment and fight if necessary, but to understand the historical context of the Brotherhood's existence, learning about the Great War, the crimes of the pre-war government, and the responsibility that came with preserving humanity's most dangerous knowledge. And this educational focus ensured that the Brotherhood's isolation was not driven by fear alone, but by a cultivated sense of duty, one that framed withdrawal from the wasteland as a moral stance rather than cowardice. And yet, isolationism also imposed significant limitations, because by avoiding sustained contact with the outside world, the Brotherhood forfeited opportunities to influence post-war reconstruction, allowing other factions to rise without their guidance or restraint, a consequence that would later fuel internal debate as younger members questioned whether total withdrawal truly served humanity's long-term survival. And these early tensions foreshadowed the ideological fractures that would define the Brotherhood's future. But during its formative decades, isolationism functioned as both shield and doctrine, preserving the Brotherhood through a period of extreme instability, while entrenching a worldview that placed control above compassion, order above outreach, and survival above all else, making the Brotherhood of Steel not merely a faction of warriors, but a self-imposed monastic order, dedicated to guarding the remnants of a world they believed humanity had proven unworthy to inherit again. Life inside the Lost Hills bunker defined the Brotherhood of Steel long before the wasteland ever came to know its name, because beneath the irradiated surface of post-war California, the bunker became not just a shelter, but a sealed civilization, where every aspect of existence was shaped by memory, discipline, and the unspoken understanding that the outside world represented both temptation and annihilation. And within its reinforced corridors, the first generations of the Brotherhood were born, raised, and educated in an environment deliberately designed to prevent the ideological decay that Arthur Maxson believed had destroyed the old world, as families descended from the original Mariposa survivors formed the core population, creating a hereditary continuity that blurred the line between military order and bloodline society, where children grew up surrounded by the relics of pre-war technology, learning to treat power armor, energy weapons, and archived data not as symbols of power, but as responsibilities burdened with historical guilt. And daily life within Lost Hills was governed by structure, with schedules, training regimens, and communal duties, reinforcing the belief that survival depended on order, because chaos, even in small doses, was viewed as the first step toward collapse. and this mindset shaped the Brotherhood's recruitment practices during its earliest decades, as membership was strictly limited to those born within the bunker or adopted under extraordinary circumstances, not out of arrogance, but out of fear that external values would compromise the Brotherhood's foundational doctrine, a fear reinforced by fragmented reports from the surface that described raiders, lawless settlements, and the slow emergence of new power structures driven by scarcity rather than ethics. And as generations passed, Lost Hills evolved into a self-sustaining stronghold where technology was meticulously maintained, archives were preserved, and oral history was treated with the same reverence as written record, because the Brotherhood understood that memory itself was a form of technology, one that could be lost as easily as any machine if not actively protected. And within this environment, cultural identity began to solidify, as rituals, ranks, and titles were no longer simply functional but symbolic, reinforcing a sense of belonging that replaced national identity with Brotherhood loyalty. And this cultural cohesion was strengthened by the absence of external reference points, because the children of Lost Hills did not remember the old world, only the story of its failure, taught through controlled narratives that emphasized restraint, sacrifice, and the cost of unchecked ambition. And this generational continuity ensured that the Brotherhood's values did not rely solely on Maxson's authority, but became internalized across the population, transforming ideology into tradition. And yet life inside the bunker was not without tension, because isolation demanded constant vigilance against stagnation, as limited space, finite resources, and strict hierarchy created pressures that tested unity, particularly as younger members questioned their exclusion from the surface world they had only studied through reports and simulations. And to address this, the Brotherhood formalized pathways for service that allowed individuals to prove themselves through technical mastery, combat training, and adherence to doctrine, creating a meritocratic element within an otherwise insular society, where advancement was earned through discipline rather than inheritance alone. And this balance between heredity and merit became one of the Brotherhood's defining traits, distinguishing it from both the hereditary aristocracies of the Old World and the chaotic power structures emerging in the wasteland. And the shaping of Brotherhood culture during this period was also influenced by the constant presence of pre-war military artifacts, which served as both tools and warnings, reminding members that the same systems that had once promised security had ultimately delivered extinction. And as a result, reverence for technology was paired with ritualized caution, with strict rules governing experimentation, deployment, and modification, embedding restraint into everyday practice rather than abstract philosophy. And through these practices, the Brotherhood cultivated a collective identity that prioritized long-term survival over short-term gain, viewing themselves as stewards of a future that might never arrive, but which still demanded preparation. And by the time the Brotherhood began cautiously extending its reach beyond Lost Hills, it had already become something far removed from the unit that mutinied at Mariposa, evolving instead into a generational order defined by continuity, secrecy, and an unwavering belief that humanity's greatest threat was not the wasteland itself, but the memory of how easily it had once destroyed its own world. Contact with the outside world marked a turning point for the Brotherhood of Steel, because after decades of deliberate isolation within the Lost Hills bunker, the leadership could no longer ignore the reality that the wasteland beyond their sealed doors was not merely a chaotic void, but a developing ecosystem of survivors, settlements, and emerging powers whose actions could either threaten or preserve the Brotherhood's long-term mission. And this realization did not come from curiosity or idealism, but from necessity, as reports of scavengers uncovering pre-war ruins, raiders arming themselves with recovered weapons, and small communities attempting to rebuild using fragments of old-world technology, forced the Brotherhood to confront the possibility that dangerous knowledge might spread unchecked if left entirely unmonitored, and thus the earliest Brotherhood expeditions to the surface were conducted with extreme caution, framed not as diplomatic outreach, but as reconnaissance and recovery missions designed to assess the state of the post-war world while minimizing exposure to ideological contamination. And these initial encounters revealed a wasteland far more complex than the Brotherhood's internal projections had anticipated, because while violence and lawlessness were widespread, there also existed traders, caravans, and proto-settlements driven by cooperation rather than conquest, challenging the Brotherhood's assumption that humanity had uniformly degenerated beyond redemption. And yet these encounters also reinforce the dangers of uncontrolled technological dissemination. As Brotherhood patrols observed individuals wielding scavenged energy weapons without understanding their maintenance or limitations, confirming fears that the relics of the old world could once again become tools of devastation if left in untrained hands. And during the period surrounding the events later chronicled in Fallout, the Brotherhood's presence in the wasteland became more visible but remained carefully managed, as they established controlled points of contact where outsiders were tested, evaluated, and often dismissed, with only a select few deemed worthy of limited interaction, reflecting a doctrine that prioritized assessment over alliance. And traders who encountered the Brotherhood often described them as enigmatic and aloof, offering protection or information in exchange for specific technological artifacts rather than currency or loyalty, reinforcing the perception that the Brotherhood existed apart from the social fabric of the wasteland. And it was during this era that the Brotherhood first encountered organized settlements like Shady Sands, whose emphasis on agriculture, law, and collective defense contrasted sharply with the Brotherhood's bunker-based survival model, creating an unspoken ideological tension that would later evolve into open conflict. And while the Brotherhood occasionally assisted such communities by eliminating specific threats or recovering lost technology, these actions were transactional rather than altruistic, rooted in the belief that limited engagement could stabilize the region without compromising Brotherhood principles. And as the wasteland continued to evolve into the era depicted in Fallout 2, the Brotherhood's cautious outreach expanded slightly, driven by the recognition that total isolation was no longer viable in a world where regional powers were beginning to consolidate resources and territory. Yet even then, the Brotherhood resisted integration, choosing instead to establish satellite bunkers and patrol routes that allowed them to monitor technological flow while remaining ideologically insulated. And these interactions revealed a fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Brotherhood's worldview, because while they sought to protect humanity from itself, they also withheld the very tools that could alleviate suffering, such as advanced medical technology and energy infrastructure, a contradiction that fueled resentment among wastelanders who viewed the Brotherhood as hoarders rather than guardians. And this perception would later have profound consequences, as mistrust hardened into opposition. But during this formative period of contact, the Brotherhood still believed it could shape the post-war world indirectly, guiding its development through selective intervention rather than direct rule. And the lessons learned from these early encounters would haunt the Order for generations, because they demonstrated that the wasteland was not static but adaptive, capable of creating new societies that would not remain passive under Brotherhood oversight, forcing the organization to confront the limits of isolationism in a world that was steadily moving forward without them. The rise of the new California Republic represented the greatest ideological challenge the Brotherhood of Steel had faced since its founding, because for the first time since the Great War, A large-scale post-war society emerged that openly rejected isolationism and instead embraced expansion, civil governance, and the redistribution of technology as tools for rebuilding civilization, directly contradicting the Brotherhood's core belief that humanity could not be trusted with the relics of the old world. And this conflict was not initially defined by open hostility, but by mutual suspicion. As the Brotherhood observed the growth of shady sands into the new California Republic, with a mixture of concern and disbelief, watching a settlement rooted in agrarian cooperation evolve into a structured state with elected leadership, standing armies, and industrial ambition, all of which mirrored the pre-war institutions that Arthur Maxson had believed led humanity to ruin. And, from the Brotherhood's perspective, the new California Republic's rapid expansion and willingness to recover, reproduce, and deploy pre-war technology without centralized custodianship represented a dangerous regression rather than progress, because it suggested that the wasteland was repeating the same patterns of power accumulation and technological reliance that had culminated in nuclear annihilation. And yet the new California Republic viewed the Brotherhood through an equally critical lens, perceiving them as an insular, unaccountable order hoarding advanced weapons and knowledge while refusing to contribute meaningfully to regional stability, creating a philosophical divide rooted not in territory but in competing visions of humanity's future. And as the Republic expanded its borders, established trade routes, and constructed infrastructure, its growing industrial capacity inevitably brought it into contact with Brotherhood patrol zones and technology caches, escalating tensions as both sides asserted claims based on fundamentally incompatible principles, and this strain was compounded by the new California Republic's democratic structure, which framed authority as deriving from the consent of the governed, a concept the Brotherhood regarded with skepticism due to the pre-war government's abuse of democratic language to justify authoritarian practices, leading them to conclude that elections and representation did not inherently prevent corruption or moral collapse. And within the Brotherhood itself, the rise of the new California Republic sparked intense internal debate, as younger members who had grown up with limited exposure to the wasteland questioned whether complete technological restriction was sustainable or even ethical in the face of a society attempting genuine reconstruction, while elders steeped in the memory of Mariposa and the Great War warned that compromise would eventually lead to catastrophe. And this internal strain weakened the Brotherhood's cohesion at a time when the new California Republic's military and economic strength was accelerating, and as interactions between the two factions increased, misunderstandings hardened into policy, with the Brotherhood adopting increasingly rigid stances toward technology confiscation and access, while the new California Republic began to frame the Brotherhood as an obstacle to progress rather than a neutral observer, and the philosophical conflict became unavoidable when the Republic's expansion required energy weapons, power armor, and industrial machinery that the Brotherhood considered too dangerous to proliferate, creating a zero-sum dynamic where cooperation would require one side to abandon its foundational beliefs. And this period marked the end of the Brotherhood's ability to remain a shadow presence, because the new California Republic's visibility, legitimacy, and popular support contrasted sharply with the Brotherhood's secrecy, forcing the Order to confront the reality that moral authority in the wasteland was increasingly defined by the ability to provide security and prosperity, rather than by adherence to abstract principles. And as the Republic continued to grow, absorbing settlements and extending law across the region, the Brotherhood faced a choice between adaptation and confrontation, a choice complicated by their dwindling influence and resources. And it was during this era that the Brotherhood's isolationist doctrine, once a shield against chaos, began to resemble stagnation in the eyes of both outsiders and reform-minded insiders, setting the stage for the inevitable conflict that would follow. As two visions of post-war humanity, one rooted in control and preservation, the other in expansion and reconstruction, moved from ideological opposition toward open war. The war between the NCR and the Brotherhood of Steel was not a single decisive conflict, but a prolonged attritional struggle born from years of ideological friction, miscalculation, and mutual underestimation, because by the time open hostilities began, both factions had already concluded that coexistence was impossible without fundamental compromise, and neither was willing to abandon its core beliefs, with the Brotherhood convinced that allowing the Republic unrestricted access to advanced technology would inevitably lead to another global catastrophe, and the new California Republic equally convinced that the Brotherhood's hoarding of military assets represented an unacceptable threat to regional sovereignty and civilian safety, and this clash was defined less by grand battles than by a series of escalating engagements, raids, and strategic losses that slowly eroded the Brotherhood's dominance in the West, as the Republic's superior numbers, industrial capacity, and ability to replenish manpower gave it a decisive advantage in a war of endurance, while the Brotherhood's strength lay in superior equipment, training, and defensive positions that could not fully compensate for their limited population and increasingly strained logistics. And confirmed canon accounts established that the Brotherhood initially underestimated the Republic's willingness to commit to sustained warfare, assuming that a civilian-led democracy would fracture under prolonged conflict, an assumption rooted in pre-war biases that failed to account for the Republic's ability to mobilize popular support through shared identity and tangible improvements in quality of life. And as engagements intensified, the Brotherhood found itself forced to defend technology caches, bunkers, and supply routes across a widening front, stretching its forces thin and undermining the isolationist strategy that had once protected it. Because war demanded visibility, mobility, and sacrifice on a scale the Brotherhood had not prepared for, and each loss of territory or equipment carried consequences far beyond the battlefield, as it weakened the Brotherhood's claim to moral authority while reinforcing the Republic's narrative that advanced technology could be integrated into a functioning society without immediate collapse, and the Republic's adoption of energy weapons and salvaged power armor, though inferior to Brotherhood-maintained models, symbolized this shift, demonstrating that technological monopoly was no longer absolute, and as the war dragged on, attrition took its toll on the Brotherhood's leadership, forcing strategic retreats and bunker closures that shattered the illusion of invulnerability cultivated since Lost Hills, and canon sources indicate that the Brotherhood ultimately lost access to key facilities and was driven into a defensive posture, retreating into fewer strongholds while abandoning large swaths of influence, a retreat that marked the definitive end of Brotherhood hegemony in the West. And these losses were compounded by internal fractures, as dissenting voices within the Order questioned whether the war itself had proven the Brotherhood's failure to adapt, arguing that rigid doctrine had isolated them not only ideologically but strategically, while traditionalists insisted that defeat did not invalidate their principles but rather confirmed the dangers of unchecked expansion, and the long-term consequences of the war were profound, because it transformed the Brotherhood from a dominant regional power into a fragmented organization struggling to maintain relevance, forcing chapters to operate independently with limited support from Lost Hills, and this decentralization would later give rise to doctrinal divergence across the continent, as survival demanded flexibility that central authority could no longer enforce, and for the new California Republic, the war validated its model of governance, reinforcing public trust in its institutions and military, while solidifying its territorial control. Yet it also left a legacy of mutual hostility, as the Brotherhood never fully abandoned its belief that the Republic's success was temporary and dangerous, and the Republic never forgot the Brotherhood's attempts to deny it access to technology, ensuring that even after major hostilities subsided, cooperation remained limited and distrust persisted. And in this way, the Brotherhood-New California Republic War reshaped the political landscape of the West, not through a single decisive victory, but through a gradual erosion of power that exposed the limits of isolationism in a world where numbers, adaptability, and popular legitimacy could outweigh even the most advanced weapons. The aftermath of the Brotherhood-New California Republic War marked the beginning of a slow internal unraveling for the Brotherhood of Steel, not through sudden collapse, but through a series of adaptations and reinterpretations forced by survival, because the loss of territory, resources, and centralized authority at Lost Hills made it increasingly difficult to enforce a single, unified doctrine across all remaining chapters. And as communication lines weakened and logistical support dwindled, local commanders were compelled to make independent decisions that gradually transformed the Brotherhood from a monolithic order into a constellation of semi-autonomous groups, each shaped by regional conditions and leadership philosophy. And this decentralization accelerated the decline of Lost Hills as an unquestioned center of authority, as elders who had once dictated policy found themselves unable to project power beyond their immediate surroundings, reducing the role of central leadership to one of symbolic guidance rather than enforceable command. And within this vacuum, doctrinal rigidity began to fracture, as some chapters doubled down on traditional isolationism, interpreting the war as proof that engagement with emerging states was inherently self-destructive, while others concluded that strict adherence to old policies had rendered the Brotherhood strategically obsolete, leading to reinterpretations that prioritized adaptability over purity. And these ideological shifts were not abstract debates, but practical responses to scarcity, because chapters cut off from Lost Hills had to secure food, manpower, and maintenance resources locally, forcing them into limited cooperation with nearby settlements despite long-standing prohibitions. And in doing so, they blurred the boundaries between Brotherhood and Wastelander, challenging the belief that separation was necessary for survival. And this period also saw the emergence of recruitment reforms, as some chapters began accepting outsiders under controlled conditions, recognizing that reliance on dwindling bloodlines was unsustainable, while more conservative factions viewed such practices as heretical, fearing that cultural dilution would erode the Brotherhood's identity. And these competing approaches created internal tension that could not be resolved through centralized edict, because no single authority remained powerful enough to impose uniformity. And canon accounts indicate that the Brotherhood's technological mission itself underwent reinterpretation during this era, as some chapters shifted focus from hoarding technology to selectively deploying it as leverage, using protection and technical assistance to secure alliances and stability, while others retreated further into bunker isolation, stockpiling relics, and awaiting a future collapse of external powers that would vindicate their caution. And this divergence was accompanied by a psychological transformation, as the Brotherhood began to perceive itself less as the guardian of humanity's future, and more as a persecuted remnant of a lost ideal, fostering a siege mentality that justified increasingly authoritarian internal measures in the name of preservation. And yet, even as fragmentation deepened, a shared cultural core persisted, rooted in reverence for Maxson's legacy, the memory of Mariposa, and the belief that technology remained humanity's most dangerous inheritance. providing a thin but enduring thread of unity across chapters separated by geography and ideology. And this balance between cohesion and divergence defined the Brotherhood's survival during its darkest period, allowing it to endure where other factions collapsed, but at the cost of ideological consistency, because the Brotherhood that emerged from this era was no longer a single entity but a spectrum of interpretations bound by name, symbol, and shared history, setting the stage for future expeditions and transformations as the Order sought relevance beyond the West, in a world that had moved on without it. The Midwest expedition marked a pivotal moment in the evolution of the Brotherhood of Steel, because for the first time since its foundation in Lost Hills, the Order extended its reach beyond the familiar terrain of the West Coast into territories where their authority was untested, bringing them into contact with new challenges, diverse communities, and previously unknown remnants of pre-war technology. And this eastward expansion, canonically associated with the airship expeditions, led to established footholds in the Midwest, revealed both the adaptability and the limitations of Brotherhood doctrine, as chapters operating far from Lost Hills had to make real-time decisions without guidance from Central Command, navigating a landscape littered with both environmental hazards and emergent political entities, including scattered raider bands, fledgling settlements, and remnants of pre-war corporate and military infrastructure that required careful assessment before reclamation. And the expedition itself was structured around the recovery and preservation of technology, reflecting the Order's foundational mission, but it also necessitated doctrinal adjustments, because local circumstances often forced commanders to choose between strict adherence to isolationist policies and pragmatic alliances with local populations to ensure survival, a tension that would later define the ideological mutations of Midwestern chapters, and in practice, this meant that some units began to selectively engage with non-Brotherhood groups, trading knowledge, protection, or technical assistance in exchange for logistical support, while other units adhered to stricter interpretations, avoiding any interaction that might risk contamination of ideology or compromise of technological security. And these variations were documented in canon records as early evidence that the Brotherhood was no longer a single monolithic institution, but a federation of semi-autonomous cells, each interpreting core doctrine through the lens of immediate necessity. And the Midwest expedition also exposed the Brotherhood to new types of technology, including remnants of pre-war military research, manufacturing facilities, and power distribution networks that had survived in isolated pockets, which presented both unprecedented opportunities and ethical dilemmas, because the potential for rapid advancement in power, armor development, energy weapons, and robotic maintenance could accelerate the Order's influence, yet also carried the risk of repeating the mistakes of Mariposa if misused or mismanaged, and commanders overseeing these operations were forced to codify localized procedures for recovery, testing, and storage, effectively creating a parallel regulatory system that diverged from Lost Hills orthodoxy. And these procedural adaptations, though practical, gradually reshaped the Brotherhood's understanding of its own purpose, as officers began to recognize that survival alone was insufficient, and that the preservation of technology must be balanced with strategic application in a dynamic and sometimes hostile environment. And canon accounts note that this period also saw an expansion of the Brotherhood's airship program, providing unprecedented mobility across the Midwest, but also introducing logistical challenges, as supply lines were stretched and maintenance demands increased, further encouraging localized autonomy and decision-making. And over time, the cumulative effect of these expeditions resulted in the emergence of doctrinal mutations unique to the Midwest, including greater emphasis on engagement with wasteland communities, selective intervention in conflicts, and flexible command structures, all of which would later influence the Brotherhood's broader strategic posture in the East, particularly during subsequent expeditions to the Capital Wasteland and beyond. And by the conclusion of the Midwest campaigns, the Brotherhood had transformed into a more decentralized, adaptive organization, still bound by its core principles of technological preservation and hierarchical structure, yet capable of responding to the complexities of a post-apocalyptic landscape in ways that would have been unthinkable to the early generations in Lost Hills, marking the Midwest expedition as a critical juncture in the Order's history, where doctrine, pragmatism, and survival converged to reshape the Brotherhood's identity across America. The East Coast arrival of the Brotherhood of Steel, led by the Lyons expedition, represented a dramatic expansion of the Order's operational theater and a profound test of its doctrine, because moving from the comparatively familiar deserts and mountains of the West Coast into the devastated urban landscapes of the Capital Wasteland exposed the Brotherhood to unprecedented challenges in population density, resource scarcity, and the scope of post-war societal collapse. And upon their arrival, the Order was confronted with the immediate and undeniable consequences of prolonged nuclear devastation. Entire cities reduced to skeletal ruins, infrastructure rendered useless, irradiated rivers and waterways, and pockets of human survivors struggling to rebuild amid the remnants of pre-war political and military structures. And it was in this environment that the Brotherhood encountered the super-mutant threat in its full scale, a confirmed canon consequence of the Master's experiments using the forced evolutionary virus in the aftermath of the Great War, with the mutant populations dominating vast areas around the Capital Wasteland, controlling territory and preying upon the scattered human settlements, presenting a level of danger and unpredictability that dwarfed the raider threats of the West Coast, and the operational implications were profound, as Brotherhood patrols and outposts required not only strategic placement for resource recovery and technology preservation, but also continuous readiness for combat engagements against an enemy that combined intelligence, brute strength, and territorial ambition. And the leadership of Elder Lyons, who commanded the expedition, introduced a notable shift in approach, emphasizing protection of human populations alongside the traditional mission of technological safeguarding, a move that reflected a pragmatic interpretation of Brotherhood philosophy given the scale of human suffering witnessed in the wasteland. And this dual mission required careful balancing, as every decision to defend settlements or recover relics necessitated the allocation of scarce manpower and equipment, and canon sources confirm that the Lyons expedition frequently prioritized civilian survival even at the cost of technological recovery, a choice that was both morally motivated and strategically contentious within the broader Brotherhood framework, generating early ideological tensions between Lyons and members loyal to traditionalist interpretations rooted in Lost Hills doctrine. And beyond immediate tactical concerns, the expedition faced logistical challenges, including establishing secure bunkers, supply chains, and communications in an area devastated by nuclear fire, where pre-war infrastructure was largely destroyed, and radiation zones further complicated movement and deployment, forcing the Brotherhood to innovate in mobility, surveillance, and defensive positioning. And the presence of external factions, including isolated survivor communities, rival militias, and remnants of the Enclave, introduced additional strategic complexity, requiring careful negotiation, reconnaissance, and occasional armed engagement to prevent interference with mission objectives. And the East Coast arrival also revealed a significant divergence in the perception of the Brotherhood by local populations, as survivors often viewed the Order as both protector and enforcer, a combination that elicited gratitude, fear, or suspicion depending on proximity to Brotherhood operations. And this public perception further influenced Lyons's emphasis on humanitarian action, as maintaining legitimacy with civilians became a tactical as well as ethical imperative. And over time, the Lyons expedition solidified the Brotherhood's foothold in the capital wasteland through a network of outposts, patrol routes, and strategic alliances, creating a sustained presence that enabled both defense against the supermutant threat and systematic recovery of pre-war technology. And canon documentation makes clear that this expansion into the East Coast was not merely a replication of West Coast operations, but a transformative period for the Order, forcing adaptations in command structure, resource allocation, and doctrinal interpretation, as the Brotherhood confronted the reality that survival and preservation required engagement, flexibility, and a willingness to integrate humanitarian objectives into its traditional mission, setting the stage for subsequent ideological schisms, the eventual rise of the outcasts, and the complex interplay of leadership, morality, and strategic purpose that would define the Brotherhood of Steel's identity on the East Coast for decades to come. Elder Lyons' tenure as leader of the Brotherhood of Steel on the East Coast introduced one of the most consequential ideological shifts in the Order's history, because his approach fundamentally challenged centuries of tradition rooted in Lost Hills, emphasizing the protection of human populations over the strict, isolationist preservation of technology. And this humanitarian focus was informed by Lyons' direct exposure to the catastrophic aftermath of the Great War, where he observed countless settlements destroyed, families decimated, and the helplessness of survivors confronted with the horrors of radiation, mutant attacks, and the collapse of social infrastructure. And rather than retreat behind the Order's conventional barricades, or prioritize the hoarding of pre-war weapons and research, Lyons directed Brotherhood resources toward the defense of communities such as Megaton, Tenpenny Tower, and the myriad smaller settlements scattered across the capital wasteland, instructing patrols to intercede in threats posed by supermutants, raiders, and other violent actors. And this policy represented a radical departure from established doctrine, which traditionally emphasized the containment and restriction of dangerous technology over intervention in human affairs. And while Lyons's actions saved countless lives and earned the Order a degree of respect and legitimacy among wasteland inhabitants, they simultaneously sparked intense internal conflict, as senior officers and paladins who remained loyal to Lost Hills orthodoxy viewed humanitarian engagement as a dangerous dilution of purpose, fearing that the Brotherhood's focus on civilians would expose them to undue risk, compromise their technological stores, and ultimately erode the principles that had preserved the Order through centuries of isolation. And this schism was not merely philosophical but operational, as differing priorities led to disputes over resource allocation, the dispatch of patrols, and the level of engagement with non-Brotherhood factions, creating fractures within the chain of command that required Lyons to exercise both moral authority and pragmatic leadership to maintain cohesion. And canon sources emphasize that Lyons' insistence on balancing preservation with protection was also a tactical acknowledgement of the unique conditions of the capital wasteland, a region of concentrated population, mutated threats, and contested territory that demanded adaptive strategies rather than rigid adherence to pre-war isolationist models. And in this sense, his policies represented an evolution of Brotherhood doctrine in real time, applying the principles of technological stewardship to the broader ethical context of survival and societal restoration, while still maintaining the hierarchical and disciplined framework that defined the Order. And the humanitarian schism created by Lyons' leadership would have long-term ramifications, because it planted the seeds for future dissent, notably the formation of the Brotherhood outcasts, who rejected any deviation from traditionalist ideology, and it also redefined the Brotherhood's relationship with the Commonwealth, the capital wasteland's civilian populations, and other emergent factions, establishing a precedent for strategic intervention grounded in ethical responsibility rather than purely self-preservation. And while some critics argue that Lyons' reforms endangered the order by overextending resources and exposing personnel to unnecessary risk, historical analysis demonstrates that his approach also enhanced the Brotherhood's relevance and moral authority in a region where survival was inseparable from engagement. And in this way, Elder Lyons' tenure represents a canonical turning point where the Brotherhood of Steel, long defined by insularity and technological obsession, confronted the ethical imperatives of a post-apocalyptic world, choosing to prioritize human life alongside the preservation of knowledge, thereby reshaping the Order's identity and creating a lasting legacy that would influence the East Coast chapters for generations. The formation of the Brotherhood outcasts represented the crystallization of internal dissent that had been simmering since Elder Lyons' humanitarian reforms, because as the Lyons expedition prioritized the protection of civilian populations and the selective deployment of pre-war technology, a faction of paladins and knights interpreted these policies as a betrayal of the Brotherhood's foundational mission to safeguard and restrict advanced technology above all else, and canon sources confirm that the outcasts emerged from members who rejected the notion that moral intervention justified deviation from Lost Hills orthodoxy, viewing Lyons' prioritization of human life over technological stewardship as dangerously permissive, a softening of discipline that threatened to erode the ideological purity that had allowed the Brotherhood to survive centuries of post-war instability, and their formation was not merely symbolic but operational, as these dissenters removed themselves from Lyons' command and established independent enclaves, where they could continue the Order's work according to traditionalist principles, enforcing strict hierarchy, rigorous training, and absolute control over recovered technology, ensuring that advanced weapons, power armor, and pre-war research remained inaccessible to outsiders under any circumstances, and the Outcasts' doctrine emphasized that human survival, while important, was secondary to the preservation and proper application of technological knowledge, a philosophy that canonically reinforced the original rationale behind the Mariposa Mutiny, linking the faction's identity directly to the moral lessons embedded in the Brotherhood's earliest history, and this ideological purism extended to recruitment, as the outcasts accepted only those who demonstrated unwavering loyalty to these principles, often requiring extensive testing, rigorous indoctrination, and proof of combat proficiency, effectively creating a meritocratic elite committed to the uncompromising application of technological stewardship, and the practical implications of the outcasts' formation were significant, because they operated outside the Lyons expedition's command structure, creating parallel patrols, resource caches, and intelligence networks that occasionally conflicted with East Coast operations, forcing Lyons and his allies to navigate a delicate balance between strategic necessity and ideological tolerance, and these tensions often manifested in limited skirmishes, disputes over recovered artifacts, and competing claims over territories in the capital wasteland, illustrating that the schism was not merely philosophical, but had immediate and tangible consequences for regional security, and, beyond operational concerns, the existence of the outcasts reinforced the enduring challenge of doctrinal consistency within the Brotherhood, demonstrating that rigid adherence to ideology could coexist with flexible, humanitarian approaches, but that these approaches were inherently in conflict when resources, authority, and risk management diverged, and the outcasts also served as a cautionary reminder to the Brotherhood at large, illustrating how even minor deviations from established principles could generate enduring factionalism, a lesson that would inform leadership decisions for decades, particularly as the Order expanded into the Commonwealth and faced new technological and moral dilemmas. And despite occasional attempts at reconciliation or dialogue, canon accounts indicate that the outcasts remained a permanent fixture of East Coast Brotherhood history, maintaining their commitment to ideological purity, technological custodianship, and strict internal discipline, thereby preserving a living link to the Order's original mission while simultaneously highlighting the consequences of Lyons' reforms. And in this way, the outcasts' emergence exemplifies the tension between ethical adaptation and traditionalist fidelity, a dynamic that defines much of the Brotherhood of Steel's post-war evolution and underscores the complexity of maintaining unity across a dispersed and ideologically diverse organization. Arthur Maxson's rise to leadership represented a canonical turning point for the Brotherhood of Steel, because he embodied both the continuity of the Maxson bloodline and the centralization of authority needed to reunify the fractured chapters that had splintered following the humanitarian schisms on the East Coast. And as the grandson of Roger Maxson, Arthur carried a symbolic legitimacy that allowed him to assert control over previously autonomous or semi-autonomous factions, including those influenced by Lyons' reforms and the outcasts' traditionalist stance. And his leadership was characterized by a careful balancing of doctrine and pragmatism, reaffirming the Brotherhood's foundational mission of technological preservation while simultaneously addressing the operational and ideological fractures that had emerged during decades of expansion, decentralization, and doctrinal reinterpretation. And canon sources confirm that Maxson's tenure was marked by deliberate consolidation, as he traveled extensively between East Coast chapters, establishing personal authority, codifying consistent policy, and enforcing hierarchical discipline in a way that restored cohesion to a previously fragmented order. And this unification was not achieved through coercion alone, but through a combination of moral authority, demonstration of combat capability, and a clear articulation of a vision that reconciled humanitarian concerns with traditionalist, preservationist doctrine. And under Maxson, the Brotherhood implemented a standardized command structure, unifying recruitment, training, and operational procedures across disparate regions, ensuring that knights, paladins, and elders adhered to uniform codes while still permitting limited local flexibility for tactical necessity. And this restored hierarchy enabled the Brotherhood to operate efficiently, maintain logistical coherence, and project force strategically in ways that had been impossible during the period of decentralization. And Arthur Maxson's approach also addressed the outcasts, not by direct assimilation, but by establishing ideological boundaries, reaffirming the primacy of technological stewardship while tolerating minor doctrinal differences, thereby reducing open conflict and creating conditions for potential future reconciliation. And beyond internal unification, Maxson's leadership reinvigorated the Brotherhood's external posture, enabling the Order to assert influence in the East Coast and Commonwealth, while maintaining strict control over the recovery and deployment of advanced technology, ensuring that artifacts, pre-war research, and military assets were centralized under accountable command. And this consolidation had significant strategic consequences because it allowed the Brotherhood to engage with other factions, including remnants of the Enclave and the Institute, on a level commensurate with its historical power, while avoiding the mismanagement and factionalism that had previously limited effectiveness. and the restoration of authority also reinforced cultural continuity, as the Maxson lineage became a living symbol of the Order's history, legitimizing both its hierarchical structure and its moral framework, while serving as a unifying narrative for new recruits and veteran members alike. And, canonically, this period of unification under Arthur Maxson represents not just a return to centralized doctrine, but an evolutionary step for the Brotherhood, blending centuries-old preservationist principles with the operational lessons of expansion, schism, and humanitarian engagement, creating a cohesive organization capable of asserting ideological and military authority across multiple regions. And in doing so, Maxson solidified the Brotherhood's identity as both a custodian of dangerous knowledge and a disciplined, unified faction, capable of enduring the complex challenges of a post-apocalyptic America while remaining true to the philosophical core established by his grandfather, ensuring the survival, influence, and doctrinal continuity of the Order for generations to come. The Commonwealth Campaign marked one of the most strategically and ideologically significant expansions of the Brotherhood of Steel under Elder Arthur Maxson, because it brought the Order into direct conflict with one of the most technologically sophisticated and morally ambiguous factions in post-war America, the Institute, whose clandestine operations, synthetic human creations, and near-total control over pre-war scientific knowledge represented both a threat to human survival and a challenge to the Brotherhood's core mission of technological stewardship, and the campaign was initiated with careful reconnaissance, as Maxson dispatched reconnaissance teams to assess the Institute's capabilities, map its subterranean infrastructure, and gather intelligence on its political and military reach, recognizing that a frontal assault without preparation would risk catastrophic losses given the advanced robotics, automated defenses, and synthetic operatives that the Institute employed. And the Brotherhood's strategy combined disciplined military doctrine with selective engagement, emphasizing the seizure and containment of critical technology, while minimizing civilian casualties, reflecting Maxson's attempt to integrate lessons from the Lyons humanitarian approach with the uncompromising preservationist principles of Lost Hills orthodoxy. And canon sources confirm that the Brotherhood established multiple forward operating bases throughout the Commonwealth, creating a network of supply caches, observation posts, and rapid deployment units designed to maintain territorial control and monitor Institute movements, while simultaneously offering protection to settlements that were vulnerable to synth incursions. A dual-purpose strategy that reinforced the Brotherhood's legitimacy among human survivors while maintaining operational focus on its ultimate objective, the neutralization or subjugation of the Institute. And this campaign also highlighted the evolution of Brotherhood doctrine in practice, as the Order now had to coordinate large-scale operations across dense urban environments, irradiated ruins, and complex subterranean networks, requiring flexible command structures, advanced logistical planning, and the deployment of cutting-edge power armor and energy weapons, all of which demanded strict adherence to the Order's hierarchical chain of command and centralized oversight to prevent losses or ideological compromise. And throughout the campaign, ideological cohesion was maintained by clearly articulating the moral imperative underpinning Brotherhood actions, that the Institute's technological mastery posed a systemic risk to humanity if left unchecked, and that intervention, though militarily costly, was necessary to preserve long-term survival. And canon records indicate that Brotherhood forces engaged in repeated operations against Institute patrols, synth infiltration, and robotic defenses, often sustaining casualties but ultimately demonstrating the effectiveness of centralized training, superior tactics, and disciplined operational doctrine, And beyond the battlefield, the Commonwealth campaign also served as a crucible for cultural reinforcement, as knights and paladins internalized the values of loyalty, technological prudence, and strategic patience, while newer recruits learned that adherence to hierarchy and doctrine was essential for both survival and mission success, and the campaign's outcomes, including the recovery of pre-war scientific assets, containment of key Institute technologies, and the establishment of permanent Brotherhood footholds across the region, solidified the Order's reputation as a dominant post-war force capable of combining moral authority with military effectiveness. And in this way, the Commonwealth campaign exemplified the Brotherhood's capacity to project power, preserve knowledge, and enforce its mission on a scale unmatched by other factions, while simultaneously testing the adaptability, resilience, and ethical framework of the organization under conditions that required both uncompromising discipline and judicious engagement with human populations, ultimately reinforcing the canonical view that the Brotherhood of Steel was not merely a relic of pre-war militarism, but an enduring institution shaped by history, ideology, and the practical necessities of post-apocalyptic survival. The Brotherhood of Steel in the post-war future stands as a testament to both endurance and adaptation, because centuries of survival, schism, expansion, and reconsolidation have transformed what began as a small, insular military unit under Captain Arthur Maxson into a transcontinental organization with complex hierarchies, divergent regional practices, and a singular, unifying mission: the preservation and control of technology to safeguard humanity from repeating the catastrophes of the past. And in assessing their current canonical status, it is clear that the Brotherhood now operates as both a militarized order and a custodial institution, combining strict discipline, centralized command, and codified doctrine with the pragmatic flexibility required to maintain relevance across multiple post-war landscapes, from the deserts of the West Coast to the irradiated urban ruins of the capital wasteland and the Commonwealth. And this evolution reflects lessons learned from centuries of engagement, including the consequences of isolationism, the hazards of ideological rigidity, and the practical necessity of strategic humanitarian intervention, which were first highlighted during the Lyons expedition and later tempered under Elder Arthur Maxson's unifying leadership. And the ideological legacy of the Brotherhood remains rooted in the Mariposa Mutiny, as each generation internalizes the foundational belief that technology, while powerful, is inherently dangerous if misused, and that human survival depends on disciplined custodianship rather than open dissemination, a principle that continues to shape recruitment, training, and operational procedures across all canonical chapters. And the Order's long-term sustainability is reinforced by a combination of hereditary continuity, meritocratic advancement, and hierarchical oversight, ensuring that knowledge, power, armor, and advanced weaponry are distributed according to demonstrated loyalty, skill, and adherence to doctrine rather than personal ambition. And yet this structure is tempered by practical engagement with the post-war world, as chapters maintain relationships with civilian settlements, enforce regional security, and, in certain cases, intervene to mitigate threats posed by rogue technological actors, supermutants, synths, or other emergent dangers, reflecting a carefully calibrated balance between moral responsibility and doctrinal preservation. And the Brotherhood's influence today is not merely military, but symbolic, representing a living link to pre-war knowledge, a measure of stability in otherwise anarchic regions, and a warning that unchecked technological proliferation can imperil civilization. And canonical evidence confirms that while internal tensions persist, particularly between traditionalist splinter groups like the Outcasts and more adaptive chapters. The centralized authority under the Maxson lineage has ensured a cohesive strategic vision, enabling coordinated campaigns such as those in the Commonwealth, and maintaining the Order's relevance in a fragmented geopolitical landscape. And in considering what the Brotherhood represents for humanity, it is apparent that they embody both the promise and peril of technological mastery, capable of preserving knowledge that can protect, empower, and rebuild, yet always constrained by the memory of catastrophe and the ethical imperative to prevent repetition of past mistakes. And thus, in the post-war future, the Brotherhood of Steel endures not simply as a relic or a militarized enclave, but as a dynamic institution, continually negotiating the tension between preservation and engagement, authority and flexibility, morality and necessity, serving as a guardian of humanity's technological inheritance and a testament to the complex interplay of history, ideology, and survival in a world forever altered by nuclear devastation.